Every Saturday morning for the past 30 years, I made the same pot of coffee. Dark roast, 2 scoops more than the can recommended, the way my late wife always complained about but secretly loved. I would sit in the same chair by the kitchen window, watch the light come up over the backyard, and think about nothing important. That was the ritual. That was the anchor. When you spend your whole career as a structural engineer, calculating load tolerances and stress points, you learn to appreciate the things that simply hold. My son called those mornings my hermit hours. He said it with a grin whenever he stopped by unannounced, letting himself in with the key I'd given him years ago. He would pour himself a mug without asking, pull out the chair across from me, and we'd sit there together, not saying much. That was enough. That was more than enough. His name was Daniel, and he was the best thing I'd ever built. I need you to understand that before I tell you what happened, because there were months-long, quiet, devastating months when I nearly convinced myself I had been wrong about him his entire life. It started the way most painful things do. Slowly. So slowly, you almost don't notice until you're already deep in it. Daniel had been married to his wife for 4 years when the Saturday visits began to taper off. Once a month instead of every week, then once every 6 weeks, then a phone call instead of a visit, then a shorter phone call, then a text. I told myself it was natural. He was busy. They had their life. His wife, a woman I'll call by what she was to me, which was simply my daughter-in-law, had a large extended family with a lot of demands and a lot of events. Birthdays, showers, reunions, holidays that somehow always fell on the days Daniel and I had plans. I noticed, and I said nothing, because I had been raised to believe that a man's marriage was his own business, and his wife was his first loyalty now. I respected that. I still do. What I could not reconcile, what kept me awake on Saturday mornings with my too-strong coffee going cold in my hands, was a feeling I couldn't name. Not anger, not resentment, something quieter and more persistent. The feeling you get when a load-bearing wall gets removed from a building and the structure is still standing, but you know in your bones that something is wrong with the math. The photograph was the first thing I noticed missing. It had hung in their hallway for 2 years. I know because I had been there the day my daughter-in-law framed it herself and hung it with a level and a pencil mark on the wall. It was a picture of Daniel and me at his college graduation. He had his arm around my shoulders and he was laughing at something off camera, and I was looking at him instead of the lens, the way you do when you forget to perform happiness because the real thing is right there. It was, without question, the best photograph ever taken of either of us. The last time I visited their house for a dinner that ended strangely early, with my daughter-in-law suddenly developing a headache around 8 o'clock, I walked past that hallway and the picture was gone. A slightly lighter rectangle on the paint was all that remained. I didn't say anything. I went home and I sat in my chair and I told myself it meant nothing. But it meant something. I just didn't know what yet. The call came from a woman named Ruth. Ruth had lived 3 houses down from us for 22 years. She'd watched Daniel grow up, attended his Little League games when I was traveling for work, slipped him cookies through the fence when my wife wasn't looking. She was the kind of neighbor that neighborhoods don't make anymore. When I answered the phone that Tuesday afternoon and heard her voice, I assumed she was calling about the HOA meeting or the Henderson's oak tree that kept dropping branches into my yard. She wasn't. I didn't know whether to call, she said, and I could hear her choosing her words very carefully, the way people do when they know they're about to change something. I saw Daniel last Thursday evening. He drove past twice, very slowly. Then he parked down at the corner for a while. I thought maybe he was on a call or something, so I didn't think much of it. But then I saw him again the following Tuesday, and he sat out there in his car for almost an hour. I watched him from my porch. I was quiet for a moment. Did he come to the door? No, Ruth said. He never got out of the car. He just sat there looking at the house, and then he left. After I hung up with her, I sat with my cold coffee, and I tried to think about it with an engineer's mind. What are the possible explanations? Maybe he'd had a fight with his wife and needed somewhere to go, but didn't want to burden me. Maybe he was thinking through a problem and ended up there by habit. Maybe Ruth had misidentified the car. But the part I kept coming back to, the part that made my chest feel like it had a hairline fracture running straight through it, was this. He had been 20 feet from my front door, and he had not knocked. I could have called him. I should have called him. but something stopped me, and it took me a few days to identify what it was. I was afraid of what he would say. I was afraid he'd have a perfectly reasonable explanation that would feel like a dismissal. I was more afraid, I think, of the conversation confirming what my body already suspected, that my son and I had drifted so far apart that he was parking outside my house like a stranger, looking in at a life he no longer knew how to enter. So instead of calling, I watched. I started paying attention the way I used to pay attention to blueprints, detail by detail, looking for where the structure had started to fail. I noticed that when Daniel did call, there was always noise in the background, and he always seemed to be just finishing up something or just about to start something. He was never simply available. I noticed that when I called him, my daughter-in-law almost always answered first, and there would be a brief pause, brief enough to mean nothing, long enough to mean everything before she handed the phone to him. I noticed that every plan we made seemed to dissolve before it materialized, always for good reasons, always with my daughter-in-law's voice somewhere in the architecture of the excuse. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I want you to understand that. I spent 40 years in a field that requires you to trust calculations, trust materials, trust the work you've done. I do not look for cracks where there are none, but I had built enough structures in my life to know when something was being quietly, methodically undermined. The second time Ruth saw Daniel's car, I happened to be there. I had started spending my Tuesday evenings on the porch again, something I hadn't done much since my wife passed. I told myself it was for the fresh air. The truth is, I was listening for something, the way the house always seemed to settle differently at night, and I developed the habit of sitting with it. I saw the headlights slow at the corner. I saw the car ease to a stop. From where I sat in the shadow of the porch overhang, I was invisible to anyone looking from the street. It was his car. I knew it the way you know your own handwriting. He sat there for 40 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my phone. 40 minutes, engine off, just sitting in the dark outside the house where he grew up. And I sat on my porch in the dark watching my son watch my house. And I have never in my life felt so much grief and so much confusion at the same time. When he finally started the engine and pulled away, I went inside and I called him. He answered on the second ring. He sounded tired. He sounded like a man carrying something heavy that he didn't know how to put down. "Hey, Dad," he said. Just that. "Hey, Dad," like it had been a week instead of 6. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I don't know why, except that I sensed the way you sense a fault line before the earthquake, that the truth would only emerge if I found the right question, and I didn't have it yet. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. Work, weather, a baseball game neither of us had watched. When we hung up, I felt worse, not better. There was something careful about his words, something edited, like he was talking to me from behind a pane of glass, pressing his hand against it, and I was pressing back, and we could both see each other perfectly clearly, and neither of us could get through. The answer came from a place I never expected. My daughter-in-law had a younger sister, a woman with bright eyes and the kind of honesty that some people mistake for tactlessness. She had always liked me well enough. We'd had pleasant conversations at family dinners when my daughter-in-law wasn't in earshot, the easy kind of talk between two people who are connected by circumstance and discover they actually enjoy each other. She called me on a Wednesday. I hadn't heard from her in over a year. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, skipping the small talk entirely. "And I'm going to trust you to be careful with it, because I love my sister, and I don't want to blow up her marriage. But I also think what's been happening isn't right, and I've been sitting on this for a long time, and it's gotten too heavy." She told me that for at least 2 years, my daughter-in-law had been telling Daniel things about me that weren't true. Not dramatic lies, quiet ones, the kind that are harder to disprove because they live in the realm of feeling rather than fact. That I had said dismissive things about their home, that I had made a comment about my daughter-in-law's family, that I had implied Daniel had made a mistake leaving his first job. Small grievances, some of them built from nothing, and some of them built from things I had said that had been shaved and reshaped until they meant the opposite of what I had intended. And on the other side, what my daughter-in-law had told me, what had filtered back to me through my daughter-in-law's careful management of every interaction, was that Daniel was overwhelmed, that he needed space, that he loved me but found our relationship stressful right now, that he was working through some things and it would be better to give him room. She had been the translator between us for 2 years, and we had both been receiving a different message than the one the other was sending. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, the floor. I'm 67 years old, and I sat on the linoleum kitchen floor because my legs simply decided the situation called for it. I had been mourning my son for 2 years, mourning him like he'd gone somewhere I couldn't reach, and he had been outside my house in the dark, unable to figure out how to come in because someone had spent 2 years quietly convincing him that I didn't really want him there. "Does he know you're telling me this?" I asked. "No," she said. "And I don't know if you should tell him it came from me. But someone needed to say something, and I kept thinking about how he looked at Thanksgiving. He looked like a person who'd lost something and couldn't remember where he'd put it." I thanked her. I sat on the floor a while longer. Then I got up, poured myself a measure of bourbon I almost never touch, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. The temptation was to call Daniel immediately and say, I know what's been happening. I know why you've been sitting outside and not coming in." But something in me understood that if I did that, if I handed him the revelation all at once, it would feel like an ambush. It would force him to choose in that moment between the truth and his marriage, and that was not a choice I had the right to make for him. What I did instead was simpler and harder. I invited him to breakfast. Just that. No occasion, no agenda. I texted him on a Thursday and I said, "Thinking about that diner on Maple we used to go to. Haven't been in years. Free Sunday morning?" There was a long pause before he replied. Long enough that I noticed. Long enough that I understood my daughter-in-law was probably in the room. He said yes. I got there early. Got our usual booth, the one in the back corner where you can see the door. Ordered coffee and waited. And when the door opened and my son walked in and saw me sitting there, something moved across his face that I don't have the engineering vocabulary to describe. It was the expression of a person who has been away somewhere difficult for a very long time and has just seen something that looks like home. He slid into the booth across from me. We ordered. We sat for a moment with our coffee. "I've missed you," I said. Just that. No accusation in it. No interrogation. Just the plain truth, offered without conditions. And my son, my 42-year-old son with his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, looked at me across that diner table like he was trying to decide whether it was safe to say something he'd been holding for a long time. And then he said, quietly, "I thought you were done with me, Dad." The booth was very still for a moment. "Why would you think that?" I asked. He looked at his coffee cup. "I was told some things. About how you felt. About I don't know. I thought I was reading it right. I thought you needed me to back off and give you your space." "I have never in my life wanted space from you," I said. "Not once. Not for a single day." He looked up at me and there was something breaking open in his face. Something that had been calcified for a long time. And I watched it go. I watched 2 years of distance and misunderstanding move through my son's expression like a weather system clearing. I didn't tell him everything that morning. I didn't mention his sister-in-law's call, or the specific architecture of what had been done. I let him have the morning. I let us have the morning eggs and bad diner coffee and a conversation that started out careful and slowly became, over the course of 2 hours, the kind of conversation we used to have. The kind where we talked about his mother, and the time he cracked the windshield of my car when he was 16 and I pretended not to notice for a month, and the structural project I'd been consulting on in retirement, and whether he still thought about the trip to Montana we'd always talked about taking and never had. We closed down the breakfast shift. The waitress refilled our coffee 3 times without being asked, and left us alone, the way good waitresses do when they can read a table. When we finally stood to leave, my son hugged me in the parking lot, held on for a moment longer than a casual hug. The kind of hug that is doing double work, that is also an apology and a question and a relief all at once. "Every Saturday," I said when he let go, "you still have a key." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else and was working up to it. I let him take his time. "There are some things," he said slowly, "that I think I need to figure out. About some things I was told. About some patterns I've been noticing." "Take your time," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." That was the beginning of the figuring out. What came after the conversations between my son and his wife, the hard reckoning that followed when he started paying attention to the distance between what she said and what was real that was not my story to be part of. A man's marriage is his own to navigate. I stayed out of it. I answered his calls when he needed to talk. I sat with him on my porch twice that spring when he needed somewhere quiet to think. I did not tell him what to do or what to decide, because that was never my place. What I know is this. My son is a good man. Whatever had been done to the information traveling between us, whatever had been quietly distorted in translation, it could not undo what we were to each other at the foundation. That's the thing about real structures, the ones built right from the start. You can neglect them, expose them to bad weather, let years of damage accumulate on the surface. But if the foundation is sound, you can always come back and do the work. You can always repair what was broken if the two people doing the repairing still mean it. On the first Saturday morning in April, I heard the front door open while I was making my coffee. I heard the familiar footsteps through the hallway, the pause at the kitchen door, the sound of a second mug being pulled from the cabinet without asking. My son sat down across from me at the kitchen table, in the same chair he'd been sitting in since he was old enough to climb into it on his own. "You're out of the dark roast," he said, looking at his mug with mild offense. "I've been meaning to get to the store," I said. "I'll pick some up on the way over next week." "Sounds good," I said. We sat together with our coffee in the early light, not saying much. The yard was just starting to come back after winter. A bird was doing something ambitious in the oak tree. My son had a little more gray at his temples than he'd had the last time I'd really looked at him. And I noticed it the way you notice all the small, irreversible things, not with sadness, exactly, but with a full attention that knows it is not forever. After a while, he got up to top off his mug, and on his way back through the hallway, he stopped. I heard him stop. I heard the silence that meant he was looking at something. I had rehung the photograph the week before. The graduation picture, the one with him laughing and me looking at him instead of the camera. I'd had a copy made after the one in their hallway disappeared, and I'd found the right frame, and I'd measured twice before making a single mark on the wall. He came back to the kitchen and sat down and wrapped both hands around his mug and looked out at the yard. "Nice picture in the hallway," he said. "Been meaning to put that up for a while," I said. "Looks good there." I thought so. We drank our coffee. Outside, the bird in the oak tree made its ambitious sound, and the morning came up slow and even, the way mornings do when they are not required to be anything other than themselves. I have been asked, since all of this, whether I'm angry, whether I carry resentment for the 2 years I spent thinking my son had moved on from me, for the specific quiet cruelty of being turned into a villain in a story I didn't know was being told. People who know what happened expect me to have something sharp to say about my daughter-in-law, something satisfying and final. I don't. What I have is something less interesting and more durable. I have the clarity that comes from almost losing something you can't replace. I have the understanding that manipulation, when it is done gradually enough, can fool even the people closest to the situation. My son was not weak for being deceived. I was not foolish for not seeing it sooner. We were both operating on the best information we had, and the information was wrong. What I know now, at 67, sitting in my kitchen on Saturday mornings with the right amount of coffee and the sound of familiar footsteps in the hallway, is that the structures worth having are the ones worth repairing. That a foundation does not announce itself. It just holds. And when you find out it's been holding quietly all along, through neglect and bad weather and 2 years of someone else's interference, the feeling is not triumph. It's simpler than that. It's just gratitude, plain and enormous. The kind that doesn't fit into any language I was trained to use. My son has a key. He always has. He always will.